With pleasure. So thanks so much, everyone, for making Dan's talk. And of course, this is the latest installment of our NTU Philosophy Colloquium Series. Thanks, Grace, for pulling all the strings, for making this particular talk happen. Thanks as well to Dan, for kindly agreeing to be a part of this series. I should mention that it gives me great pleasure, both professionally and personally, right, to introduce Dan to this particular talk, given that we met in 2013 when I was still a fledgling PhD scholar and you were already an established name in the field of narrativity. And at the time, I believe you were advertising your book, Radical Enactivism. And that's, of course,
Yes.
become a key part of your, contribution to philosophy. So given that I don't want to miss anything, in Dan's profile, I'll proceed to read the following excerpt. So Daniel Hutto, right, who joins us today, is the senior professor of philosophical psychology and head of the School of Liberal Arts at the University of Wollongong. He's also served on the Australian Research Council College of Experts, right, chairing its Humanities and Creative Arts panel. He's the author of the award-winning, and he's been the author of many award-winning pieces of research. And this comprises 7 books, 3 of which have been published under MIT Press, and more than 120 research papers in various peer-reviewed journals and book chapters. He's the co-author of Radicalizing Enactivism, right, the title I mentioned, and its sequel, Evolving Enactivism. Now, both of these books have been published 4 years apart, again under MIT Press. His other books include Folk Psychological Narratives and Wittgenstein and the End of Philosophy. He's the editor of Narrative and Understanding Persons, published under Cambridge University Press, and Narrative and Folk Psychology, right, published this time under Imprint Academic. A special yearbook, Radical Enactivism, was published in 2006, focusing on Dan's philosophy of intentionality, phenomenology, and narrative. Dan is regularly invited to speak internationally, not only at philosophy conferences or, for that matter, colloquia like this particular colloquium, but also at expert meetings of anthropologists, clinicians, educationalists, narratologists, neuroscientists, and psychologists. So without further ado, Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Melvin. Thank you so much. And I return the compliment. It's a great pleasure, both personally and professionally, to see you as well, and your group, and to speak to you guys. So this paper in particular is I've only given it once before, and it's not yet in print. It's like COVID. It's taking a long time to be done with, or come into being in this case. And here it's, I think, one of my most recent papers also in testing out some new ideas. What we've actually presented it elsewhere as a grant proposal so that I could follow up from it and see if the ideas are viable. What that means is, in terms of this talk, is that the firmament of the first part and the second part, which are the challenges, are met by a rather, I might call it skating onto thin ice suggestion, which I think has legs, but I'm interested to hear if you guys think so as well. So it's much more, I wouldn't call it quite a work in progress. It's an initial pitch and a sketch, and your objections may be useful, or comments may be useful in thinking through how viable or tenable the proposal is. So there's some real live gist to this business. So I'll with that, without further ado, I'll get going. I first want to just open up by saying something about the power of narratives and some core assumptions that are going to be operative in the background. So as philosophers, you may want to challenge those core assumptions, or you might want to go in for the more auxiliary hypotheses that we start to examine as we go along. The core assumption here is, let me just move this so I can see my own screen, or minimize everyone for a moment. Yeah. The core assumption here is that the way we narrate our lives, that is to say, how we make sense of who we are and why we do what we do, matters to our mental health and well-being. So as I go along, you may wish to challenge me in what I'm thinking, or at least save that for the questions at any point you feel that there's assumption here that you don't agree with. What that would mean is that narrative practices, I think, can promote mental health. For example, the way some people narrate their lives can empower them and help them to cope resiliently when it comes to dealing with specific challenges and overcoming certain impediments. I think there is some good evidence of this. At least there's evidence that people claim that narratives can make this kind of positive difference. Narrative exposure therapy, for example, has been used to treat the effects of trauma in refugees and to prevent psychiatric illness, and it helps with stronger coping. I won't get into that now, but the usual idea is that the more rich the narratives told, the better the coping, and there's some empirical data around this. But we also could see that narratives at work in things like mentalized focused interventions have shown that long-term effectiveness in the treatment of borderline personality disorders, which is training for individuals about how to, in the language here, how to better mentalize. Now, you might think of that as just use of theory of mind skills. I'm not going to get into this either because it would take too long, but a lot of my work has been in the books, even that Melvin mentioned, is to argue that we can best understand theory of mind abilities through narrativizing capacities. If that's right, then this work will translate into an example in which narrative capacities or skills help us to better engage with others. And there are other cases where stories have been used, individual stories, social stories they're called, to assist individuals with autistic spectrum disorders to help greater social understanding for those individuals. And those stories become very tailored to their particular concerns and help to scaffold their engagements with others. Again, we could get into a longer discussion of any of these. I think those give us at least prima facie grounds for thinking that that thesis may be true. But of course, it's a double-edged sword. Narrative practices can also derail mental health, so that the way we narrate or the way a person narrates their lives can disempower them or make them less capable or able to cope, sometimes dramatically, leading in some instances to depression, despair, and in the worst cases, death. Now, let me be clear about this core assumption. It would be incredible to suppose that only narrative practices matter to mental health, and that's not the thesis on the table. That would be claiming something like, our narrative practices alone and on their own matter to mental health. The proposition under scrutiny here is far more modest. It's just that narrative practices can make a difference, and sometimes a pivotally important difference to our mental health, positively or negatively. To illustrate, the more modest claim holds that in addition to many other factors that influence, say, addiction, quote, the agent's self-narrative also has an influence. That comes from McConnell, whose work I'm going to focus on quite a lot in this first section, as you'll see. What might account for this influence? It's been hypothesized that the narratives we weave about ourselves significantly impact on our capacities for self-governance. So that seems to be the fulcrum for explaining how they make a difference into our ability to govern our own actions. So now, what's going to follow in effectively 3 acts is this. Act 1, I'm going to offer a philosophical analysis of how narrative practices can influence mental health. And here I'm really going to focus on work done by McConnell and Stoke in 2018 and their account of the role that self-narratives can play in recovery from addiction. Essentially, I'm going to be describing their account, and what's, I think, important about it, I think it's fairly plausible, but I'm going to suggest that their account generates certain philosophical questions or might generate certain philosophical challenges. So Act 2 will detail 3 skeptical challenges that would cast doubt on whether narrative practices of the sort described in Act 1 can or should be used to influence mental health. So some of the challenges are skeptical about the ethical credentials of using narratives in this way. The third act shows how it may be possible to address the trio of skeptical challenges introduced in Act 2 if we rethink and or explicitly restrict the sorts of narrative practices we use when seeking to govern and shape ourselves. Now, what's perhaps interesting about the proposal that I'm going to present to you is that the challenges are the skeptical challenges are philosophical character, the proposal in Act 3 is a philosophical response to those. What's not been tested is how well that change might work in practice. So there's two things we could be evaluating where this could go wrong. You might think that the proposal in Act 3 doesn't effectively respond to the problems. You might also think it doesn't answer the philosophical cut and thrust of the problem, or you might think even if it does, it might have practical, we might have problems implementing it in practice or something of that kind. So there could be a couple of points at which you might want to object to the proposal I'm going to advance. You might also wish to decide that you want to protect the account given in the first section and try to answer the challenges in some other way or diffuse them in some other way. So there's lots of options, I suppose, for anybody who's listening to think about how we might want to assess the situation. Okay, but that's the structure of the talk. So we'll start with narrative practices in addiction recovery, and I want to look here to get some detail on how that might work. And obviously, if the point holds here, then we will have skewered the core assumption that narrative practices can make a difference, because if they make a difference only in this one domain, then they'll make a difference. But obviously, I think that this may generalize. If we find that this analysis is on the money, then we should expect it to find that narrative practices might make a difference in other areas of mental health as well. Okay. So McConnell and in some papers in 2016 and McConnell and Snoke in 2018 provide a philosophical account of how narrative practices make a difference to our mental health, focusing on cases of successful and failed attempts to recover from addiction. In doing so, they embrace some fairly standard philosophical assumptions about the roles that narratives play in self-understanding and self-constitution. It is well known that attempts to recover from addiction have mixed results in the general populace. Why so? Well, McConnell and Stoke propose that part of a possible answer. They maintain that an addicted person's self-narratives can play a critical part in a person's prospects of successfully recovering from addiction. As they put it, or they hold that, quote, existing forms of addiction treatment, for that reason, will tend to be more effective and efficient if they are complemented by narrative-focused interventions. So here again, it's not to say that the narratives necessarily do that all of the heavy lifting or even necessarily the heavy lifting, but they can make a difference, which was our original hypothesis. Based on the findings of qualitative studies conducted in Sydney, these authors identify self-narratives as a key factor, which helps explain why certain individuals do better or worse in their addiction recovery efforts. They hypothesize that people who are more successful in their addiction recovery efforts reliably manage conflicts that arise between two kinds of threads in their self-narrative. The threads that highlight their recovery goals and support them, and the threads that highlight and support their proneness for continued drug use. So that's the core of the story. According to their proposed explanation, a person's recovery prospects are importantly influenced by that person's ability to accommodate and smooth out conflicts that arise between these competing threads in their self-narratives. Effectively, at the core of their hypothesis is what we can call, for our purposes, the sense-maximizing thesis, or I'll abbreviate SMT in some of the slides that follow. The proposed explanation leans on McConnell's 2016 assumption about what drives us to enact certain narratives. He writes, quote, given a certain self-narrative, some futures make more sense than others, and we are inclined to enact our self-narratives so that they make sense. So there's two components to this. It's the certain making more sense against a certain background, and the tendency to enact the narratives that fit the background story. So it's going in two directions. The sense-maximizing thesis, SMT, predicts, therefore, that a person will prefer self-narratives that best fit what that person takes to be the pattern of their life. So those self-narratives become recurrent and dominant. In a mutually reinforcing way, the self-maximizing thesis also predicts that a person will tend to enact the narratives that better fit the dominant self-narrative. So these become quite reinforcing. If the narratives are enacted more often in line with what they expect of themselves, then they will also continue to expect more of that of themselves, and so on and so forth. Accordingly, the self-maximizing thesis helps to explain why some people fail to recover from addiction despite sincere and concerted efforts to do so. Now, this will happen, for example, if they are, quote, inclined to continue their disvalued drug-using lifestyle because it nevertheless makes the most sense given who they understand themselves to be. Now, something else about the sense-maximizing thesis, it has a kind of co-authoring constraint. The assumption here is that other people in our lives play a big part in determining which of our self-narratives become the most dominant and established. The self-maximizing thesis assumes that determining which self-narratives make the most sense of who we are is not a solo or solitary project. So there's two broad senses in which co-authoring occurs. First, we draw on ambient, co-created, and co-sustained social cultural archetypes and tropes in order to make sense of our lives and actions and experiences. And I've talked about this in other publications. The broad idea is that we get a lot of the source material for how we are going to understand ourselves from what's ambient in our sociocultural environments. Second, others play a more direct role in determining which self-narratives we find credible. This is because we look to others to confirm which narratives they think best and most accurately apply to us, so they too can help to establish which narratives become most dominant. Co-authoring is at work whenever individuals come to, quote, strongly identify with the aspects of their self-narratives that are consistently verified by others, McDonald and Snoke point out. And according to their analysis, the trouble then comes when a person is trying to recover from addiction is under the continual influence of others who push the person to conservatively identify with established, though disvalued self-narratives. Another factor that looms large in this story is a person's background beliefs. So the addictive person's best chance of success in recovery is to find more factually credible threads to weave in with the dominant threads, thus creating a stronger, new and preferred overall narrative. A person's background beliefs can impede their ability to establish such new narrative threads, ones that are plausible enough to integrate into a new self-narrative that would aid their recovery. So even more general background beliefs or on topics that aren't just related to their own particular tendencies. And for example, essentialist beliefs about the fixed and unchanging nature of selves could lead an addicted individual to wonder how someone of their type, on the assumption that there is such a thing as their type, someone with apparently fixed tendencies could ever really change and recover. And that could be disruptive to creating a new self-narrative. Background beliefs of this stripe can fuel debilitating and disempowering negative cycles of self-doubt, for example. The crux of McDonald and Snoke's 2018 explanation of the role that self-narratives play in failed recovery is ultimately put in terms of a conflict of values. They write, quote, no matter how much one explicitly values recovery, one also values the things implicitly represented by the established self-narrative, diachronic agency, self-knowledge, and social inclusion. To take an example, they give the case of Nicole. And for her, an incident at her practical examination seriously challenged the truth of her recovery-directed self-narrative. This time, she did not have the mental resources to continue to try and convince herself and others that her recovery narrative was still true of her. She could much more easily explain her failure by incorporating it in her more established addiction self-narrative, her old self. And so they give the analysis that this is what brought about a failure of her ability to convert her behaviors into those of recovery. Now, assuming the sense-maximizing thesis, the only positive way forward for addictive people, if this is the case, is to find reliable means of integrating various conflicting threads in their overall sense self-narrative to create a new one. The prospects of successful integration depend fairly directly on the addictive person's ability to deal with and diffuse the established narrative. And we're told that, quote, whether a new narrative thread is ultimately integrated more permanently in the wider self-narrative depends on successfully enacting it and convincing others of its truth. So the 2 points I was emphasizing earlier. As such, an addicted individual seeking to change and recover needs special narrative strategies and tactics. They could, for example, include drawing on classic narrative tropes and archetypes, such as the redemption script, for example, when telling their stories. That will help give them to overcome the sorts of background beliefs that might otherwise derail their attempts. But only if old narrative habits and tendencies can be kept in check will new narrative threads have any chance of being endorsed and to taking root. According to the sense-maximizing proposal, the core processes by which a person becomes persuaded of a new self-narrative's viability depends on that narrative's responsiveness to the truth. It must, so they say, quote, stand up to the facts. The self-narrative that makes the most overall sense carries the day. It's the one that is accepted and endorsed as capturing the truth about who the person is. Thus, any stable new self-narrative thread must cohere with the wider set of a person's established self-narrative threads. And any stable new self-narrative thread must be intersubjectively verified. So you can see the language here of truth and coherence playing a big role in this account. Now, these authors also stress that narrative therapies that exist might be a method or a useful way in which to address these issues. So narrative therapy holds out the possibility that a person might master techniques that will allow them to reauthor their lives and reweave a new overall self-narrative with freshly established alethic credentials. The main aim of narrative therapy is to help people get beyond reliance on thin, off-the-shelf narratives or those that others have supplied to them, enabling these people to tell richer stories about their lives, richer in the sense of finding other aspects that have been perhaps overlooked or downplayed. Ideally, narrative therapy restoring results in what these authors cleverly call increased responsibility, enabling people to become more able to respond, more able to cope. As White, who is the one of the originators of this therapy, puts it, as people become more narratively resourced, they find that they have available to them options for action that would not have otherwise been imaginable. So this opens up their affordance space, if you like. It opens up their possibilities for acting in the world through re-narration of their understanding of themselves. In the best cases, when and if the therapy works, the result is that the person's revised and preferred self-narrative becomes credible and dominant. In such cases, the new self-narrative provides some basis for imagining realistically achievable projections. So it's on the basis of that re-narration that certain things become more plausible, more imaginable to the person, and then become in line with the self-maximizing thesis, more possible to enact, and then the cycle goes in the other direction. Okay, so that's the first act. The second act is shorter, and the third act is shorter still. So you'll be glad to know it's an inverted triangle of a talk in that respect. I'm just going to run through 3 skeptical challenges that can be raised. If this is the sort of account that we want to give, there are philosophical objections and skeptical challenges that might be raised against the core assumptions. The first is what we might call the explanatory challenge. And it goes like this. Some of our narrative practices aim to provide us with true and verifiable self-narratives. We just saw in the language of the previous account how heavily it relied on that kind of talk, telling us who we are and why we do what we do. But according to the skeptic, our narrative practices simply cannot achieve that ambition. Simply put, to the extent that a narrative practice is conceived of as truth-seeking, a truth-seeking enterprise in any strict sense, it must fail. This will be so if, as a general rule, or quite globally, narratives, including so-called factual narratives offered by historians, are incapable of getting at and settling on the truth of things. So a very prominent voice spokesperson for this brand of skepticism on this particular challenge comes in the form of Alex Rosenberg. And if you haven't seen it, he has a book out in 2018 called How History Gets Things Wrong. The subtitle is The Neuroscience of Our Addiction to Stories, but the core theses are precisely to a sustained book-length argument in favor of this challenge. Rosenberg argues that those forms of history that employ narratives are simply unable to supply explanations that meet the required standards of getting at the truth. He argues that whatever else historical narratives supply us with, they do not provide enough to enable us to, quote, understand anything, let alone be the best or the only way to understand anything. The root trouble with all so-called narrative explanations is for him that they are irredeemably indeterminate. And so we will have met this kind of, anyone familiar with the philosophy of mind will have, or philosophy of language will have run into this kind of problem before with Quine or Dennett or other figures. This is not a new comment. Effectively, we don't have any means to choose between credible rivals, and as such, quote, all these types of accounts fail to identify real causal forces that drive events. So it's against that standard that he thinks narratives fail to get at truths or provide true explanations of who we are or why we do what we do. There is no empirically respectable method for choosing between rival narratives possibilities. Hence, there is no scientific basis for deciding once and all between them. So we have no preferred outcome here. This is why, as he puts it, quote, science is not stories, it's theories, laws, models, findings, observations, and experiments. If we want to get at the truth of things, we need to look to science, not stories. For Rosenberg, when it comes to the evaluation of their truth-revealing prospects, the inevitable conclusion is that all narratives are wrong, wrong in the same way, and for the same reason. His ultimate complaint can be universalized not just to history, but to all meaning-making activity that involves narratives. Quote, the demand of the interpretive disciplines that we account for ideas and artifacts, actions and events in terms of their meanings is part of the insatiable hunger for stories. He says, doesn't deny that we're attracted to stories, like he describes that as an attraction akin to that of mother's milk, but it's an attraction in this case in explanatory terms that is better understood as an attraction to something more like mother's heroin. So our addiction to narratives, he thinks, is very strong, but they don't yield anything of particular value. The best descriptions of a reality, by contrast, he thinks, the best descriptions of reality, quote, he says, don't come in the form of stories with plots. Quote, our demand for plotted narratives is the greatest obstacle to getting a grip on reality. So if the previous account was relying on the idea that we were using our narrative practices in order to get at a truer account of ourselves, this completely, if this objection is let to stand, it completely undermines that possibility from the get-go. All right, let's move on to what I'll call the scope challenge. This will be familiar to people who know the narrativist literature. The scope challenge can be put this way: assuming that anyone and everyone might be able to reauthor their self-narratives is inappropriate, as it makes false assumptions about certain individuals and populations. Any proposed account of the role narratives might play in mental health is vulnerable to the scope challenge if it commits to conceiving of persons in terms of strong, quote, narrative self-constitution. As in the previous section, McConnell and Snoke did. Strong narrative self-constitution views hold that narrating our lives or experiencing them narratively, even if only implicitly, is necessary for being a person. You see this kind of thing in popular literature. Here we have some from a clinic saying, every patient has a story, tell us yours. But of course, the challenge here is not every patient does have a story. Galen Strawson is, of course, the spokesperson for this particular challenge. He says, although some people have narrativizing tendencies when thinking about their lives, not all do. There exists a range of possibilities for temporal self-experience, he claims. Not everyone tends to experience or live or see his life in a storied way. So that challenge kicks back against the idea that a therapy or practice in the mental health would assume that this was the case as a baseline. Okay, so final challenge is what we might call the manipulation challenge, is a more ethical challenge. The reauthoring techniques of narrative therapy risk potentially unethically manipulating people by encouraging them to re-narrate past events in ways that may be actively truth distorting. So this seems to assume that there can be a truth that you could get at, but the problem now is that the methods that we might use here risk of giving us of distorting that truth. Narrative practices that get us to review the past are especially vulnerable to the dangers of such a manipulation. Such approaches are those that use guided imagination exercises to prompt clients to revisit significant events from their pasts with the intent to reauthor them. Decades ago, Loftus reported findings which revealed that, quote, many individuals can be led to construct complex, vivid, and detailed false memories via a rather simple procedure. The process is that of, quote, imagination inflation. A person is asked to imagine childhood experiences that did not happen to them, and the mere act of imagining the detailed episode increases confidence that it actually happened. And in the early versions of these experiments, it would be something like taking this sort of photograph, cropping it, and creating a new photograph that would give some kind of prompt to someone to recall an episodic memory of something that never happened. And they fairly reliably do when they're presented with this sort of photo manipulation. Interestingly, in a paper, in some experiments that followed up on this, they discovered, and here's the title, quote, actually, a picture is worth less than 45 words. Narratives produce more false memories than photographs do. So you don't have to doctor a photograph in order to get this result. You just have to tell a little story, and we can get person to generate false memories just on the basis of that. For example, when you were between 4 to 6 years old, you and your dad went up in a hot air balloon in Wanganui. You didn't go far off the ground because the ropes anchoring the balloon were still attached. It was around May, June, a colder season. That's enough to get people to imagine that event might have happened, to start to believe that it actually did, and weave stories around it about that particular event, even if they're somewhat gappy. So this is the concern, that we might be leaving ourselves open through these kind of narrative practices to an unethical manipulation of patients or clients. Okay, so those are the three challenges, and we've now heard the initial analysis. So what might we do? My suggestion is going to be, as I said, a way that we might philosophically get around these three challenges in one fell swoop, which suggests also a practical direction that the narrative therapies might go in if we wish to keep away from those. And the question is, if we did this, would that in fact still give us enough of a viable therapy to do the sorts of work that might need to be done, say, in making a positive difference to mental health as opposed to a negative one? So that last question, I think, is still a very open one, but I'll make my pitch for the different story. question I want to pose is this: might we update the official story about narrative therapy's aims and methods so as to avoid the trio of skeptical challenges raised in the second part of this talk? The recommendation on the table is that narrative therapy could do so, at least theoretically, and that it would benefit, again, at least theoretically, from adopting what Goldie in 2012 calls the fictive stance. Within the fictive stance, a narrative is regarded as fictional, but not, quote, in virtue of its contents being false, but in virtue of it being narrated and read or heard as part of a practice of a special sort. So in the therapeutic practice, we might engage in some narrative of storytelling for a very particular purpose and bracket some aspects of that storytelling in ways that will enable us to avoid the three challenges I just mentioned. We adopt the fictive stance, for example, when we treat what is purported to occur in a narrative non-factually. For example, when we treat it as make-believe, as we do when pretending or entertaining a possibility within certain other storytelling practices that are probably very familiar to us. Now, other philosophers take a special interest in the question of how to make sense of truths within such fictions and even the metaphysics of these. But we can put those concerns aside for the moment. We needn't get into that here. For our purposes, the question is, can we explicitly adopt the fictive stance in successful therapeutic narrative practices? Can we reframe our therapeutic storytelling activities so that the question of the factual truth or falsity of the narratives in questions is bracketed and does not arise? Now, I think there are special advantages of thinking of narrative practices that confer therapeutic benefit as operating in an explicitly fictive mode, part of that practice. Narrative therapy, therefore, I want to at least explore this possibility, might benefit from endorsing the fictive stance, and thus from taking a leaf out of what has been called the solution-focused brief therapy playbook. A key device in solution-focused brief therapy is that it asks clients to imagine a future in which their problem has miraculously dissolved. As the title is a giveaway, they're interested in the solutions, not the basis of the problem. Solution-focused brief therapy asks clients, for example, to describe in increasing detail what would be different for them and about them in the imagined future scenario where their problems had dissipated. Solution-focused brief therapy is, or quote, spends very little or even no time on the origins or the nature of the problem for that reason. What that would mean in terms of the shift in the aims of the therapy would be, rather than using talking cures to define and establish a truth-based self-narrative, that the narrative therapist could seek to reverse the polarity, focusing instead on, quote, constructing a future trajectory rather than achieving past accuracy. That would, as you'll see in a moment, dissolve, I think, both the explanatory challenge, because there's no claim here that we need to get at the truth. And secondly, it also dissolves the manipulation challenge pretty evidently, because there's no basis for thinking that we might have a distorted picture of the past through this means. If it proves feasible to adopt the fictive stance in narrative practices aimed at promoting mental health, then the point is no question would arise about the accuracy of the imagined scenarios deployed in our efforts at self-reshaping, especially if they're future-oriented. If one thinks of oneself as, in these cases, having dissolved one's problem, the result might be how one would want to act and how one could push to achieve that end, without falling back into the idea that that has to be an accurate depiction of one's current capacities. As I said a moment ago, the explanatory challenge is thereby immediately dissolved. We're not making any claims that the narrative has to recover or make itself credible to the person. And the manipulation challenge simply drops away too. Now, the scope challenge can be dealt with also, I think, so long as in using the fictive stance, we simply make no assumption or make no strong commitment to the narrative self-constitution view of persons. So one could simply operate, just concede to the scope challenge, if you liked, that not all persons do necessarily see their lives narratively, there are certain therapies that might not work for them if that's the case, and narrative-based ones might not, but that doesn't mean that they won't work for other people, which is a much stronger claim, not even one I think that the skeptics of narrative practices like Strawson has tried to pursue. So those are the proposals on the table. Thank you very much for listening, and I guess we could turn over to discussion.